now let me introduce Dan. I have this great pleasure to introduce Dan. Dan is full professor at the University of Copenhagen and Oxford. And he is also the director of the Center for Subjectivity Research, which has established itself as a center of excellence in phenomenology and the philosophy of mind in the course of its almost 20 years of existence, if I'm not mistaken. Now, Dan's philosophical background is in classical phenomenology, but it is fair to say that throughout his philosophical production, Dan has always attempted to bridge gaps, for instance, gap between phenomenology and analytic philosophy of mind, but also the gap between philosophy and empirical sciences of the mind. And in fact, the Center for Subjectivity Research has been so successful in acquiring funds, projects, and collaborators, partly also because of its interdisciplinary approach to philosophical problems. And here I think I shouldn't miss the opportunity to mention the two large grants that Dan has recently acquired, both of them on Intentionality. The first is the ERC Advanced Grant, and the second one is a research grant by the Carlsberg Foundation, which both started this year and will last for further 5 years. So now Dan's work has gravitated around three main areas of research. In the theory of the self, he has argued for the existence of a minimal form of subjectivity that accompanies all our conscious experiences. In social cognition, he defends the view that in certain cases we can directly perceive others' mental states. And finally, in collective intentionality studies, he argues that collective intentionality, or at least some of its main fundamental forms, necessarily require empathy. Now, on all this topic, Dan has extensively published, and I wouldn't even start to mention all his publications, which are literally legion. So let me just draw your attention to some of his most recent books. Now, these include his last book, Husserl's Legacy, Phenomenology, Metaphysics, and Transcendental Philosophy for OUP, and the monograph study, Self and Other, Exploring Subjectivity, Empathy, and Shame, again for OUP. I would also like to mention the Phenomenological Mind, which he has co-authored with Sean Gallagher for Routledge. And finally, Dan has also edited recently two Oxford handbooks, one on the history of phenomenology and the second one on contemporary phenomenology. Dan's talk today is on we in me or me in we, collective intentionality and the plural subject. So Dan, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alessandro, and thank you, Olivier. I'm, of course, extremely honored being invited to give this keynote talk. I wish all of us could have met in Switzerland, but I'm also kind of very excited about trying out this format. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, let me get started. So, as all of you will know, the capacity to engage in collective intentionality and to jointly be directed at objects and goals is a key aspect of human sociality. Likewise, when it comes to we experiences, the we is very much an integral part of everyday life. We can solve tasks together, we can reach decisions together, we can share emotions together, we might, move furniture together, we might laugh together. I can also identify with a national team and exclaim, we won the match. Or I might even identify with past generations of, national partnerships and, express my regret over the fact that we Danes lost to the Swedes in the 17th century. Now, if one looks at how philosophers have been addressing these issues, I think it's fair to say that there has been a certain focus on action. There's been a certain focus on how it's possible for individuals to collectively intend to do something. And often the examples are rather mundane. How do we manage to go for a walk together? How do we manage to paint a house together? The big discussion has then been whether or not it's possible to reduce collective intentions to individual intentions, and there's also been a widespread discussion of where exactly to locate jointness in these collective intentions. What I think has been less the case has been a focus on the link between collective intentionality and the question of identity. How is the I and the we related? I don't think that has been target of the same kind of attention as discussions of action, collective action. But if one looks at some of the earlier works on collective intentionality, it's not very hard to find texts that recognizes the importance of addressing the relation between the individual and the group. And let me just mention two texts, one by the social psychologist William McDougall, book The Group Mind from 1920, and also a text by a German sociologist, Alfred Vierkant, from 1923. What one can find in both of those works are a lot of things, obviously, but also an attempt to discriminate between different types of collective experiences. And there's a number of examples that are actually first discussed by McDougall and then subsequently taken up by Vierkant. And let me just mention three of those examples. The first example concerns a group of men on the road leading across a wilderness to a walled city. A sudden threat of danger sends them all flying in panic towards the city gate. Now, there's no cooperation involved, but we're not just dealing with individual actions, since the actions of each of these individuals are influenced by the presence and influence of the other. So there's something more going on here than merely individual action. Now, contrast that with another case. A number of pilgrims wish to reach a walled city, each for its own private purpose. Now, all of them know that robbers along the way may pose a danger to single travelers, and so they consequently join forces and travel together. And as a result, their actions display a high degree of cooperation. But their cooperation is only a strategic means to an individual end. Each of them is only choosing the most efficient way to realize his own goals. And then the final example, an army of crusaders approaches a walled city that needs to be captured. Each crusader identifies with the army as a whole and prizes its reputation and success as an end in itself. Each crusader experiences himself as part of a we and experiences himself as exercising a collective will. Now, what both McDougall and Vierkant are arguing for is that the last example is a different kind of explanandum than the former two examples, because in that last example, it seems pertinent to refer to a certain kind of collective identity if we are to understand what is going on. And it will also be that kind of example that I will be particularly focusing on in what follows. Now, going back to the contemporary discussion, I think, again, it's fair to say that the consensus view is that it's not possible to reduce collective intentionality to a mere summation or aggregation of individual intentionality. But there is, as I've already said, some disagreement about exactly where to locate the collectivity. And let me here just pinpoint two of the kind of popular proposals. The first proposal argues that the collectivity has to be located in the content, that is, in what individuals believe, intend, feel, or hope. So if A and B collectively intend to go for a walk, A and B each has to individually intend the joint walk. And so intentions of the form, I intend that we do something, are crucial. Now contrast that with the suggestion that the focus has to be on the subject side. The proposal would be that collective intentionality presupposes the existence of a plural subject, a we. It's this we that is the proper bearer of the collective intentional states. Now, what I want to do in the following is to look closer at this latter proposal, because I think an account that only considers content is prima facie pretty unpromising when it comes to types of strong group experiences that I'm interested in. There might be other forms of collective intentionality that perhaps can be adequately addressed by a focus on on collective content, but I don't think it does justice to the kind of phenomena that I'm interested in. So let's look at the plural subject. Now, the most well-known contemporary proponent of this approach is probably Margaret Gilbert. According to her proposal, we cannot account for the social world in singularist terms. We have to operate with the notion of a plural subject or we. And as she has at pains to make clear, a plural subject is not a mere aggregate of persons. It's rather the name for a number of persons who are unified in a certain way because of a joint commitment. And it's precisely this joint commitment that links the individuals such that they jointly constitute a plural subject. Now, Gilbert is very insistent that this reference to a plural subject is not supposed to amount to some endorsement of the existence of a group mind. She takes group minds to be metaphysically suspicious and excessive. But there are some people who have argued that Gilbert's reluctance here actually has the implication that her own view, including her defense of a plural subject, remains too individualist. Why is that the case? Well, because on Gilbert's proposal, the challenge is presented as explaining how something like collective intentionality is possible. How can it grow out of individual intentionality? And one might argue that the real challenge, the argument could be that this already presupposes too much. Perhaps the real challenge is precisely the opposite priority. So perhaps one could argue that standard accounts of collective intentionality, including those favoring a plural subject, remains characterized by an individualist bias. I mean, why assume that the first person singular is somehow more self-explanatory than the first person plural? And one forceful defense of this view can be found in Bayer's article, Doing Things with Others, the Mental Commons from 1997. Now, as Bayer points out, and this is something that Hans Bernhard Schmidt has also picked up on subsequently, we have all been brainwashed by Descartes by assuming, or into assuming, that the first person singular has this obviousness to it. And Bayer basically argues that it's wrong to assume that the analysis of singular person action must precede that of plural person action. Rather, what needs explanation is really our separateness. It's not, that is what is puzzling and in need of explanation rather than our togetherness. Because on her account, individual action is really something we all have to learn, and we have learned it by departing from common action. And to kind of buttress that proposal, Bayer points to a lot of action types that in their origin involves a plurality of actors. So just think of, very obvious ones like marrying or tangoing or buying. But she actually supplies a large number of examples when you can see here, comforting, collaborating, conferring, confiding, commiserating, contradicting, convincing. I mean, all of these types of actions are not really actions one can do on one's own. Now, towards the end of her text, Bayer then argues that the position she ultimately wants to defend is not simply the claim that action is essentially interpersonal, but rather the claim that reason is essentially interpersonal, and that both action and reason only derivatively and parasitically are solitary and individual. And so I think this certainly is a different proposal, but it's important, I think, to recognize that that Bayer's focus, and I think I take her to be defending a form of social constructivism when it comes to action and reasoning, are precisely focused on action and reasoning. She doesn't really talk about selfhood. She doesn't really talk about experience. But wouldn't it somehow be natural to consider that proposal as well? I mean, would that not be a kind of a natural way to explore this criticism of the individualist bias further? But here I think it's important to discriminate between two different ways of understanding a defense of the primacy of the we. Now, what kind of primacy is worth considering? And I mean, if we go back to McDougall, I mean, as you might remember, the title of his book was The Group Mind, and so he is certainly an ardent defender of the group mind, but even he was not willing to accept the existence of some kind of collective or super individual consciousness. So that's not how he wants to, so he's not willing to accept the primacy of some kind of collective consciousness. And I mean, obviously one can find a similar skepticism if one revisits Searle's work, who argues that the notion of group mind is mysterious at best and at worst incoherent. And on Searle's account, I mean, there cannot be anything like group consciousness because all consciousness is in individual minds. So I mean, that might be, I mean, so again, one way to understand a defense of the primacy of the we might be by arguing for the primacy of collective consciousness. But I think very few people are really willing to buy into that. But there might be another option that is worth to consider more, which is perhaps more worth considering, and that is an option that I will label the social manifestation claim, here adopting a phrase from Robert Wilson. And so what does that view amount to? Well, the basic claim would basically, I mean, the claim would basically be not that there is a collective consciousness first, but rather that the experiencing subject or the first person perspective of this or the self only comes forth in certain kinds of social circumstances. So the claim would be that the self, the I or the first person perspective is communally grounded. It requires the we for its emergence. And I think that if one adopted that view or endorsed that view, I mean, then one would certainly have been able in a fairly ardent manner to reject the individualist bias that allegedly is characterizing many of the standard accounts of collective intentionality. But of course, one question that then comes up is, well, is that a view that has any defenders? And let's look at a few. So it's not hard to find people currently defending a form of social constructivism when it comes to the self. And I'm going to present now a recent article where the authors basically argue that we shouldn't understand the self as some kind of substantial entity. Rather, what should be labeled by the self is a certain embodied and gendered self-experience. On their view, the self-experience is conditioned by discursive power structures. It's those power structures that enable the formation of individual subjects. And there are no pre-social ontologically bounded entities that by necessity are singular. To suggest that there is really a Eurocentric misconception. Rather, what we need to realize is that the self is a complex and fluid intersectional construction. It's fundamentally social and relational. And so there is nothing primitive about selfhood and first-person experience. This is was a view defended by 3 authors in an article that came out last year. So that would be one consideration, somewhat different. So a consideration coming from social constructivism. Here's a slightly different kind of argument that draws on developmental psychology. The claim now being made is that in early infancy, at the very beginning of psychological maturation, what we find is not a well-established, well-demarcated individual, but rather a kind of anonymous collectivity. There's no ecological perspective, no subjective experience, no distinction between me and others at the very beginning of life, but rather a state of syncretic sociability. There's a certain kind of anonymity to that life that lacks both individuation and numerical distinction. And so on that account, the relevant question to ask is not how the child begins to recognize the presence of another mind. No, the relevant question to ask is how the child learns to differentiate itself from others belonging to the very same sphere of experience. And so the claim has even been made that it's our capacity to share experiences during those very first moments of life that really allows us and enables subsequent subjective experiential episodes. And that view has been defended by Welsh in an article, in a book called The Child as a Natural Phenomenologist, Primal and Primary Experience in Merleau-Ponty's Psychology. Now, one limitation to both of the views I've just presented is that none of them are really explicitly relating their discussion to issues in social ontology. But it is, of course, also possible to find people in that discussion that has been making comparable claims. And I think two people that I want to briefly talk about is on the one hand Hans Bernhard Schmidt, and on the other Lynne Baker. Now, Schmidt is known for arguing that plural self-awareness, the awareness of us sharing intentions, emotions, and experiences, precedes both self-experience and other experience. And he has also suggested that one is first aware of oneself as a member of a group and only subsequently aware of oneself as an individual. So to that extent, plural self-awareness and group membership precede and ground singular self-awareness. Now, I've discussed Hans Bernhard's position on a number of previous occasions, including in an article published a few years ago. So in what follows, I will primarily be considering Baker's arguments. And I'm primarily now referring to an article she published in the Journal of Social Ontology in the first issue back in 2015. So what is the basic claim or argument that Baker wants to make? She wants to argue that individual human persons are socially constituted and that they consequently belong to the domain of social ontology. Now, how does she kind of build up to this conclusion? Well, on her account, to be a human person is to possess a first-person perspective. But it's important on her account to distinguish two different stages to the first-person perspective, namely the rudimentary stage and the robust stage. What is the rudimentary stage? Well, that is our non-conceptual capacity for intentional behavior, which requires consciousness and intentionality. And this is not unique or distinctive of human beings. It's also something that many non-human animals possess. But that has to be distinguished from what she calls the robust stage of first-person perspective, which is the conceptual capacity to conceive of oneself as oneself from the first person. Now, according to Baker, the robust stage is what provides us with an inner life. It allows for self-consciousness. It allows us to take responsibility for the things we do, care about the future, rationally assess our goals and values, etc. And in order to possess all of that, which is really what is unique to and distinctive of humans, that is something that requires concept perception. I mean, again, we're talking about the conceptual capacity to conceive of oneself. So it requires concept possession. This in turn requires or involves language acquisition, which in turn presupposes a linguistic community. And so, I mean, going down that line of argument, the claim, of course, would be that what is distinctive of human persons requires capacities that ultimately depends upon one's participation in a linguistic community. Now, one question that has to be raised, though, is the question concerning the rudimentary stage of the first-person perspective. which, as I've already mentioned, is taken by Baker to include consciousness and intentionality. I mean, the obvious intriguing question is whether that is also a social property, this rudimentary stage, and whether that also then in turn would be constitutive and dependent upon a community. Now, Baker doesn't really discuss that very extensively in her text. She argues that evolution by natural selection among groups obviously requires groups to exist, and that if one were kind of pursuing an evolutionary explanation of phenomenal consciousness, I mean, perhaps a reference to groups might then be relevant. But I think it's fair to say that there is no widely accepted evolutionary explanation of phenomenal consciousness. And even if there were, and this is pointed out by Baker herself, it's not obvious that that would actually seal the case, because we need to make a distinction between social communities and communal memberships. And they are not identical with or simply to be equated with any kind of group. So even if one could argue that groups are somehow presupposed for a rudimentary stage of the first person perspective to emerge, that would still not show that a community or social community is required. But Bacon kind of leaves it there, and then takes herself to have proven the decisive point, which is that human persons, which involves this robust stage of the first person perspective, depends upon membership of a linguistic community, for which reason human persons are social entities. Now, I think that what kind of comes out of Baker's discussion is the need for further conceptual clarification. Now, if we define personhood in terms of a capacity for critical deliberation, the endorsement of values, moral commitments, and so on, I don't think that the claim that the human person is a social entity that requires communal membership is a very controversial claim. So to put it differently, I mean, so one might ask, what kind of positions are ruled out by this? And I would say only very, I would say odd forms of kind of radical libertarianism. I mean, to imagine that each of us develops our own preferences, be they culinary or religious or political, in splendid isolation, and to imagine that we only at that moment start to engage in social and communal activities because we think that that will increase the likelihood of us being able to realize our preferences, I think is nothing but a fantasy. So I think it's a very mainstream view that if human personhood is defined in the way Baker does, I don't really think it's a very controversial claim. The problem is just whether that is sufficient. I mean, to make that point, whether that is sufficient to block the individualist bias. I mean, is that sufficient to show that self and experience are derived from the we? And I don't think that is the case. Now, Baker also claims, kind of a bit en passant, that we only have an inner life as a result of being linguistic community members. And that certainly sounds like a more promising position if one wants to eradicate, if you will, the idealist bias completely, in order to show that self-own experience, even in its most kind of minimal form, are based upon community membership. So I think that's where we need to go. The question, of course, is whether such a view is really defensible. I mean, is inner experience really dependent upon group membership? And here I think that that Baker's article ultimately is a bit unsatisfactory, because on the one hand, she argues that having an inner life and being in a possession of self-consciousness is something that requires the robust stage of the first-person perspective. But at the same time, she also argues that consciousness and intentionality is already to be found at the rudimentary stage of the first person perspective. And so I think there might be a certain tension here. And I think what we ultimately need to do is really to be more clear about exactly how we are talking about both self-consciousness and also selfhood. And let me just quickly run through a number of different conceptions of self-consciousness that one can find in the contemporary debate. So consider narrative self-consciousness. This is about being able to narrate a unifying life story, linking my past, my present, and the future. You know, where am I coming from? What am I currently being preoccupied with, and where am I heading? So that's one form of self-consciousness. Another form of self-consciousness would be what one might call social self-consciousness. If I appraise how others assess me, and if I feel pride or shame as a result, this is a form of self-consciousness, but it's one that could be called social, in the sense that it's very much relates to how others are viewing or appraising me. Again, that might be distinguished from reflective self-consciousness. I can think about an current experience, self-ascribe it with the use of the first person pronoun, like I'm thirsty or I have a headache. Again, that should be distinguished from another form of self-consciousness that we might call agentive self-consciousness. I mean, consider the difference between, experiencing the difference between moving one's own arm and having somebody else move one's arm, where only the former experience would be felt as being agentive. That's a special form of self-consciousness. And finally, let me just introduce the notion of pre-reflective self-consciousness, which on most readings basically amount to having an experience of the experience when one is living through it. Now, this might seem a little bit perhaps odd to say, but I mean, there's a very widespread debate in philosophy of mind, and a lot of people who would argue that the difference between a conscious and a non-conscious mental state is really due to the presence of self-consciousness in this minimal form. So on that account, phenomenal conscious states would involve a minimal form of self-consciousness. So this is just to make it clear that when we are talking about self-consciousness, it can mean a lot of different things. And it seems obvious that if we want to explore and analyze it, and if we want to relate it to the question of community membership, I mean, we really need to be very clear about what kind of self-consciousness it is that we are talking about. Now, self-consciousness is equivocal, but even more so is the notion of self or selfhood. And again, one could easily illustrate that in many different ways. Let me just use two examples. So in an influential article from 1988, the cognitive psychologist Ulrich Neisser distinguished 5 different senses of self that he also thought would develop ontogenetically up through the development of childhood. So he distinguishes ecological self, interpersonal self, extended self, private self, and conceptual self. And in a Target article published in Journal of Consciousness Studies from 1999, again Strawson, summarizing discussions that has occurred in that journal, summarizes more than 20 different notions of self. I don't want to mention all of them, but let's just pick out, for instance, the narrative self, or the dialogical self, or the normative self. So I mean, there's a lot of potential confusion going on here, a lot of demarcations being made. And so just to rehearse once more, when confronted with the question of whether we and the awareness of group membership precedes and enables selfhood and self-consciousness, again, much will obviously depend on exactly what one means by self and self-consciousness. Now, let me just try to give you one illustration of this an illustration of how one thinker has tried to navigate between these different claims. And I want to just spend one slide discussing Husserl. So what one finds in Husserl's oeuvre, I mean, he actually operates with quite a number of different notions of ego. But let me just here pinpoint the difference between a pure ego and a personal ego. So I think that Husserl's notion of the pure ego can basically be understood as referring to the very first personal character of consciousness, to the very subject or subjectivity of experience. And according to Husserl, this feature of consciousness, that he also sometimes calls Meinheit, mindness of experience, is not socially constituted. It does not come about as a result of some contrast, some experiential contrasting between me and somebody else's conscious life. No, what we are dealing with here really concerns the fundamental and intrinsic and inherent individuation of consciousness. And according to Husserl, it's this intrinsic individuation that also is fairly formal, that would prohibit and make metaphysically impossible any kind of, real fusion between streams of consciousness. But as Husserl also points out, this pure ego, this formal individuation, should not be confused with the ego as the real person, with the real subject of the real human being. And how does Husserl view that, this personal ego? Well, he says that our identity as persons, our personal character and individuality, is something that is constituted by our personal conviction, commitments, decisions. It's something that is under constant development. It's by being committed and devoted to a certain set of values. It's by leading a life in light of specific norms that I come to have a view and voice of my own, that I come to be a true individual in the robust sense of the term. And so for Husserl, and he's quite explicit about this, we really come to develop into a person, we come to acquire a personal ego, and we come to develop as a person in and through social relations with others. So my being as a person is not my own achievement, rather it's a result of what Husserl would call my communicative intertwinement with others. So I just think it's informative to just have this in mind as an attempt to distinguish different levels of selfhood and to then argue that where some of them might be dependent upon social relations, social interaction, and communal membership, others might not. And again, because this is where I now want to go. I mean, I just want to re-emphasize the need for these distinctions, because I think there is an obvious difference between arguing, say, that an individual achieves selfhood at the point at which he first begins to act toward himself in more or less the same fashion in which he acts toward other people, and on the basis of such a definition of selfhood, then to argue that the self emerges in social interaction within the context of a complex differentiated society, which many symbolic interactionists in the tradition from Mead has done, and which I also think is related to Husserl's discussion of the personal ego, and for that matter also Baker's discussion of human personhood. There's a huge difference between making that claim and making the claim that we can define the self in terms of the first personal or subjective character of phenomenal consciousness. That is to argue that experiences qua conscious are inherently characterized by a distinctive subjective or self-involving character, and to argue that this type of selfhood is socially constituted and that it presupposes a communal grounding. I mean, we just need to be very clear about whether it's the first view we are defending or the second view. And again, the obvious question to ask is, well, what view is it that an ardent defender of the primacy of the we and the plural self must commit to. And I think that if one really wishes to extirpate, I mean, the so-called individualist bias, one really has to go for the more radical approach. To just accept, to just defend the former approach, which, as I've repeatedly said, I don't consider a very controversial claim, just won't do the trick. The view one has to defend is really the claim that self and experience are essentially interpersonal and only derivatively individual. And again, then one might ask, well, I mean, but is that really a view that can find any defenders? And my reply would again be, yes, you can find people defending that view. So let me just quickly give you a few quotes from articles published during the last 20 years. So we have the claim being made that the phenomenal quality of conscious states is interpersonal constituted. We have claims being made that subjectivity is born from the intimacy of intersubjectivity, and that it's the latter, that is intersubjectivity, that gives rise to capacities such as self-awareness, representation, language, and even consciousness. We have claims being made that human beings who are denied all socially mediated attributions of self remain completely selfless and thus without consciousness. We have claims being made by developmental psychologists that it's only when the infant's unconscious mental states are being represented and mirrored back by the caretaker that the infant starts to have subjective experiences, and that if we were to be deprived of social interaction, we would all remain unconscious zombies. So these are claims that are kind of put together from the 4 articles mentioned here. So one can find that view being defended. So just to kind of recap at this stage, as I've said repeatedly, depending on what notion of self one is employing, the attempt to assign primacy to the we, I think, is either fairly uncontroversial, or it's fairly, or no, let me say what I think. I think it's very contentious. Now, again, I think few would dispute that kind of claim if the self we were kind of trying to get a handle on was, say, a narrative self. But I think if the target is experiential subjectivity, I think it really commits one, I mean, this attempt at pushing the primacy of the we, I think it commits one to a social constructivist take on phenomenal consciousness, one that, at least in the most articulated versions that I'm familiar with, tries to explain phenomenality through some socially mediated version of higher order representationalism. Now, I don't have time to criticize that here. I've done that in other contexts. All I want to say is that I don't think it's very surprising that some recent defenders of this approach, of this attempt at basically accounting for phenomenal consciousness through some kind of social construction, that some recent defenders of this view has come out as illusionists. And I mean, one person I have in mind here is J. Garfield, who basically now defends the view that if we think there is phenomenal consciousness, we have basically fallen victim to a cognitive illusion. So again, I mean, I think so I guess what is the lesson that I'm trying to kind of present here? Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is that the view that phenomenal consciousness is a social construction is so extreme that I don't find it very surprising that some people basically bite the bullet and says that actually it's, the whole thing is an illusion. There is really no metaphysical problem here. Now, again, I don't want to go into a further discussion of that. It would lead too far afield. What I just want to quickly point out is, let's just assume that the social constructivists were right. I think the question that would then emerge would be the following. Would such a position, and again, the whole line of argument has been that we should consider more radical options if we really wanted to do justice to collective intentionality, and especially to kind of strong group experiences. And the question that now emerges is whether we, at the end of that long road, have really reached a stage where we might be in a better position to account for that kind of phenomena than the other options that we were critical of. It's not obvious to me that that is really the case. And what I have in mind here is not simply the fact that if one really buys the illusionist position, well, I mean, then of course one would also be forced to deny the existence of the explanandum, because if you're an illusionist, there really are no group experiences. I mean, you might think that you have a group experience, but again, that's just because you have fallen victim to a cognitive illusion. But it's not that objection I have in mind. No, I have another objection in mind, which can be summarized or labeled the plurality requirement. And what is the point here? Well, the point is that if we think about we experiences, if we think about the we, well, then I think there are kind of two obvious requirements. On the first hand, the we is a first-person plural. The we requires an experiential anchoring. It's something that must be experienced from within. So I think that's what makes the we very different from certain other group memberships that can be ascribed to members completely independently of their personal endorsement or even awareness of their membership. So consider by contrast, my membership of people with a certain blood type. Now, I actually don't know what blood type I am, but presumably I have one blood type and I'm consequently a member of the people having the same kind of blood type. Now, I don't think that has anything to do with the we. A we, something that has to be experienced from within. That's what makes it a first-person plural. But in addition, the first-person plural is also plural. It requires plurality. And even if the we also involves some unity, I think it would be a big mistake to look for the kind of unity in question as if it was some kind of fusional, undifferentiated unity. I think that what a we articulates is a certain genuine being with one another that requires a preservation of difference. So one way to put this is to say that the interpersonal differences that has to be preserved, they should be bridged. That's what gives them the unity rather than erased. And I think for that simple reason, I think the suggestion that the we precedes and enables individual differentiation is something that simply has to be rejected as incoherent. I think that proposal just doesn't do justice to the phenomenon that we are trying to capture, namely the we as precisely an experiential differentiated social structure. Now, this is of course not just a view that I would be proposing. Let me just give you three other people who have argued for somewhat similar views. Martin Buber famously said that he by we means a community of several independent persons who have reached a self and self-responsibility. Scheler on the nature of sympathy argues that the consciousness of us is founded on the respective self-awareness of each. And finally, we have the developmental psychologist Daniel Stern arguing that it's only from the moment where infants can sense that others distinct from themselves can hold or entertain a mental state that is similar to one they sense themselves to be holding, that the sharing of subjective experience or intersubjectivity is possible. So I think in all of these cases, what we find highlighted is precisely the importance of difference. So just systematically, what are the three options? I mean, I'm sure one could construe further options, but I mean, these are at least the three fundamental ones. Either we can view the we as being prior to the I and the you, or we can view the I, the you, and the we as being equiprimordial, or we can say that the I and the you are prior to the we. Now, I've just been arguing against option one, because I think that if we are meaningfully to speak of a we, if we are to speak of a first person plural, we need to preserve plurality and differentiation. And to conceive of the we as something that precedes differentiation, as some kind of undifferentiated oneness, I think is just to misunderstand the very notion. So perhaps option two is more plausible. But here I would say that I just don't find it evident that each and every self-experience and other experience necessarily requires a concomitant or preceding we experience. I mean, I can be aware of myself as an embodied agent without at the same time being either reflectively or pre-reflectively aware of myself as part of a we. And I can be aware of another without that awareness necessarily giving rise to a shared we perspective. So perhaps not so surprisingly at this stage, my sympathy goes for option three. Now, let me just anticipate a possible objection. I mean, it could be said that this whole effort of trying to unearth an I or a self that is independent of sociality and communal grounding is both ahistorical and unnatural. I mean, de facto, all of us are together with others from the very start. De facto, all of us are embedded in sociality from the very beginning. And so if we for a moment kind of forsake abstract reasoning and turn to real life, I mean, isn't it kind of obvious that the we must be given primacy? But I think there are two fairly obvious ways to reply to this objection. The first is that we need to distinguish de facto co-occurrence, which I don't think anybody are really denying, with constitutive interdependence, which is a much more contentious and theoretically interesting claim. And one cannot use evidence in favor of the former as proof for the latter. I mean, I think that's just an argumentative fallacy. Secondly, I think this is also important to bear in mind. We need to, I think, preserve the difference between sociality and community. And even if one could argue for a fundamental role of sociality, I don't think that in and of itself would do the trick of proving the primacy of the communal we. I mean, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that infants are ultra-social basically from birth onwards, but I certainly don't think that that shows that they already from that start are part of a communal we in any, plausible sense of the term. So proving the importance of sociality does not prove the importance of community. So I'm almost done now. Let me just quickly return to the beginning of my talk. So what I started out doing was to very briefly discuss some current dominant proposals concerning the nature of collective intentionality. And I raised this worry that the dominant models might have an individualist bias. Now, my conclusion is that it doesn't really seem to be a very good idea to turn matters on the head. So one might say that my main accomplishment has really been negative. Why is it not a good idea to turn matters on the head and argue that what really needs to be explained is individual intentionality rather than collective intentionality? I don't think so. because I would consider individual minds to be a precondition rather than an obstacle to genuine we phenomena. Now, saying all of that is certainly not to say that the attempt to appeal to a plural subject is wrong-headed. I'm very sympathetic to that approach. I think there are a lot of phenomena that really requires reference to matters of identity and identification. And as I kind of said earlier, I mean, there might be a need for referring to shared content as well, but I really can't see how simply referring to content in and of itself can do justice to the kind of group, to the specific kind of segment of phenomena that I was interested in, that I am interested in. I mean, remember the 3 examples that I gave you at the beginning of the talk, where my specific focus concerned types of collective intentionality that precisely involved the agents experiencing themselves as part of a we. I mean, that's the kind of phenomenon I'm interested in, and I think in order to do justice to those, I think a reference to a plural subject seems pertinent. And let me just end with a few concluding remarks. So first of all, even if, and I guess that's a kind of corollary of my argument today, even if I do think that an engagement with collective intentionality, and especially the types of collective intentionality that I'm interested in, even if I do think that that requires a simultaneous or concurrent exploration of what it means to be a self, I would also say that the inference kind of goes the other way as well. I mean, I do think that we need to think about what it means to be a self in order to do justice and be able to explain specific types of group phenomena. But I also think that the existence of genuine we phenomena are bound to put pressure on the kind of account of selfhood that we are operating with. I mean, if we really acknowledge that there is something like we perspectives and we intentions and we experiences, I mean, if they are considered genuine explananda, I think this will rule out a number of standard traditional assumptions about the nature of selfhood. I mean, just to take one, and I'm not really proposing that that is currently a very widespread view, but still, to conceive of the self as a disembodied, unchanging soul substance, I think it's very hard on the basis of that kind of metaphysical view to accommodate the many kinds of group experiences that we are finding in everyday life. Secondly, I would also insist on the importance of paying closer attention to the process of identification. I mean, what precisely is it that allows us to make this transition from an embodied singular self-experience to an experience of oneself as one of us? And I do think that process of identification are crucially involved here. I think that we identity is something that comes about as a result of identification. But what exactly to understand by identification is certainly in need of further exploration. And I think one important issue here concerns the kind of identifications that can happen and what is the term, that is feasible in face-to-face relationships, which I think might arguably be a different kind of identification than the one we can perform at a distance vis-a-vis a more anonymous collectivity. So I think this is all topics in need of further exploration. So just a final slide. If we go to Heidegger, we will find him in some of his lectures from the 30s arguing that that if we think of the we as the plurality, as an assembly of individual human beings, we will not have grasped what a genuine community is. According to Heidegger, we only come to experience ourselves as individuals because of our participation in a community. And whether or not we do belong to this community, to this folk, is not really up to our decision. Rather, it is something that is always already decided based on our history and our descent. And again, without making the obvious, well, now I am making the obvious point. Of course, this was claims made by Heidegger in Germany in the 30s. Now, contrast that with a view by a lesser well-known figure, Menachem Mendel Morgenstern of Cork, which was a Polish rabbi. And so he's known, he didn't really leave any writings, but he's known for a lot of enigmatic statements, including the following. If I'm I because you are you, and you are you because I am I, then I'm not I and you are not you. But if I'm I because I am I and you are you because you are you, then I am I and you are you and we can talk. And it shouldn't probably come as a surprise at this stage that my sympathy is squarely with the rabbi. And I do think that these issues that we are discussing here, I mean, whether group membership exhaustively define who I am, is certainly not just theoretical questions. These are also political questions. So thank you very much for your attention.